Hello, if you liked my story, don't forget to like, comment, share. This story belongs to owner Dialer's Tales of the Forbidden City concept. In this concept, there is a timeline and all the stories are connected to it. Book 3 Chapter 1 August 6, 70 kilometers east of Alpine, Nevada, USA. Nevada, known as the Silver State, was a state located in the western, mountainous west, and southwestern regions of the United States. The large state, sandwiched between California, Oregon, Idaho, Utah, and Arizona, had a desert climate. There were 3 Skorsky Blackhawks and 2 Apaches flying very low over the state's sparse forest areas. Nico stared out the window of the Blackhawk. He had spent the last 2 days working with the SEALs. He rubbed his hands together nervously, barely noticing. He hadn't realized he was swinging his leg until one of them tapped him unkindly on the leg. He turned to his left and saw Staff Sergeant Sanchez. Sanchez looked at him blankly. "Don't show it, it'll make the others nervous," he said as he handed him a piece of gum. Then he clicked the button on his radio. "Okay, gentlemen, I repeat, we are going to attack a mansion where we think Polanov is staying. We'll also be providing jammers so there's no unpleasantness. We have air support. We'll have 2 Apaches and an AC-130 gunship to support us. Once you secure the area outside, the ground forces and the rest of the Blackhawks and Mages will land and take over the rest. The CIA and our guys think this is a manufacturing facility. So we'll get backup from the NCB unit. When we get close enough to the mansion, everyone will change into their NCB uniforms. Nobody should try to take off their mask or clothes. Remember, these guys are making viruses there, you can't go home with something you wouldn't want to get," he said and released the latch. "What is NCB?" Nico asked curiously. "Nuclear, chemical and biological weapons. Soldiers who specialize in these will meet us below," Sanchez said with a smile. The large mansion was designed in the shape of a giant T. The horizontal part of the T formed the magnificent front of the mansion. In front of the 2-story building was a large, circular pool. The marble pool was 3 stories high. Each story had angels depicted as winged babies, water flowing from jugs in their hands. Around this pool was a 2-meter-high small garden arrangement of violets. A gravel road for cars led to the large garage in the back. The mansion was surrounded by plane and chestnut trees. After the farm borders, a pine forest began. Approaching a level area where the forest allowed landing, the Blackhawks quickly unloaded the teams they carried. Moving without hesitation from where the helicopters had landed, the SEAL and Vatican mixed unit entered the mostly pine forest with almost no trouble. The trunks of the trees in the darkness seemed to be watching them. The steam rising from their mouths stretched out, occasionally making crackling sounds as they stepped on dry branches, sometimes making the already nervous group pull the trigger. When they reached their GPS location a few hours before dawn, the Ghost pulled the radio from Tank's backpack and said, "Bravo 1, Bravo 2, we're in position." "Roger Bravo 1, stand by," the radio operator replied to the Ghost. The Ghost made a series of gestures to the group behind it, and they collapsed silently and began to don NCB protective suits made of thick, durable plastic. The AC-130 gunship was a modified version of the C-130 Hercules transport aircraft to provide close air support to special forces units in hot conflict zones. The aircraft, which had more engine power, climb rate and range than a standard C-130 Hercules transport aircraft, began to climb through the clouds and into the sky. Although the aircraft was quite successful in low-altitude flight, no one knew what kind of weapon Polanov and his men had in their possession. The aircraft, which could use any runway, could climb 610 meters per minute, and was equipped with 4 Allison T-56A-15 turboprop engines, each with 4,910 horsepower. There were only 12 of these aircraft in the U.S. military. All weapons on the AC-130 were located on the left side of the aircraft. It was the aircraft with the largest diameter and caliber weapon in the Air Force inventory. 1 plus 105mm M101 Haubeke light howitzer was the aircraft's heaviest weapon. The howitzer had a recoil system. This howitzer had an effective range of over 7,500 meters and could fire 6 to 10 rounds per minute. The 40mm Bofors L-70 cannon, which had 2 in the H model and 1 in the U model, had an effective range of 4,500 meters and could fire 100 rounds per minute. The aircraft also carried 256 40mm rounds. The U model had one 25mm Gau-25 cannon and could fire 1,800 rounds per minute. This cannon, which could fire from 3,700 meters, also carried 3,000 rounds. The H model also had 2 additional 6-barreled M61A1 Vulcan cannons. Using the AC-130's classic attack tactic, it climbed to 3,000 meters, then set its speed to 300 km/h and began to circle counterclockwise over the target area. This altitude and speed had been tested for decades for effective fire and accuracy. The aircraft crew, who turned on their thermal and optical receivers, began to detect and mark their enemies, while the pilot said over the radio, "Eagle is ready." Images from C-130 began to come to the SEAL and Vatican teams. Meanwhile, other ground forces had begun to report their arrival. When all units were in position, the voice on the radio gave the operation signal. The NCB-suited team had put on their gas masks. The masks had electronic screens, just like they normally used. The information sent by AC-130, who assumed the role of guardian angel, and the points he marked were visible on these screens. When the first patrol appeared, the Ghost gave the signal to spread out over the land. The 4-person patrol consisted of mercenaries. All 4 wore sand-colored, gray or khaki baseball caps and were protected by Kevlar assault vests. All of them were carrying G-33s. They were wearing new generation khaki polar fleeces. When they got within 20 meters of them, the Ghost gave the signal by pressing the radio button once. Mother Superior Roberta raised her thin long fingers towards the mercenaries, muttered a spell and then touched the Ghost on the shoulder. When the Ghost received the signal and pressed the radio button twice again, making a click sound that only they could hear, Sanchez, Tank, Doctor and Bullseye fired at the patrol they had aimed with their silenced weapons. While the sounds of the weapons, suppressed by the spring and scale system, were heard, no sound was heard as the men who were shot in the head fell to the ground. The High Priestess had used a spell called Profound Silence to silence the patrol's location and the surrounding area, so that even if someone escaped or pulled the trigger of her weapon, they wouldn't be able to alert anyone. Bravo 1, Bravo 2. "We're past the patrol and advancing," the Ghost said, sounding pleased with the situation. As they approached the mansion, Tank opened 2 long boxes from his back. The first was the drones and the second was the jammers. The jammers they activated were cutting off the broadcast of all communication systems except the frequencies they used. When Tank was finished, he touched his radio and said, "It's all us now, boss." The Ghost looked at Roberta, who was casting a new spell. Roberta's eyes had turned silver as she finished her spell. This spell, called Starlight, was used to find those hiding with the invisibility spell. The woman shook her head, scanning the entire area with her eerie eyes. The Ghost pressed the radio button and said, "Bravo 1, ready for attack." Both guards were former Marines. They noticed this immediately when they entered the deep silence spell, but there was little they could do about it. The first man was shot in the back of the neck and out of his mouth as he was cocking his weapon, while the other was shot in the hand and then in the head as he tried to reach his radio. Another priest cast a blur spell where they had fallen silently. Even if they were seen by accident, the images of the 2 men became blurred, so that it would be impossible to tell what had happened unless you looked too closely during the spell. They entered through the side door. Most people were asleep in the building they entered at dawn. So, in the silence, the group made their way through the mansion, which had been purchased by an anonymous account some time ago, and as they moved as silently as possible on the varnished wood, the Ghost paused for a moment in the dark corridor. He shivered for a moment. He knew that this shiver was due to a spell. Mother Superior Roberta, who came diagonally from him, grumbled, "This is ridiculous." The Ghost looked at him curiously. "Nonsense?" "They put a spell in the middle of the corridor for an alarm." "In the middle of the hallway?" Sanchez asked, coming up behind the 2 of them, sweaty and stifled in his NCB suit. "In the middle of the hallway," Roberta agreed, What do we do now? Nico asked, tapping his fingers on the stock of his gun. The voices of guards and people giving orders began to come from above. The ghost said with a bored expression, "Kill anything that moves." After 10 meters, the room door suddenly opened and a man stepped into the middle of the group. Nico, who was face to face with the big man with the AK-47 in his hand, saw the man who was almost 2 handspan bigger than him and hit the man in the throat with the butt of his M416. Just as the doctor was about to shoot the man, Sanchez hit the doctor's shoulder and shook his head. Nico hit the man's inner thigh with the back of his right foot. When the man dropped to his knee, Nico's eyes widened when he realized that there were others behind him. First, he kneed the kneeling man in the face. He reached out his left hand and said, "Shire Yonda," and closed his eyes. There were many flashes of light on the tips of his fingers. Then he leaned his gun on his shoulder and pulled the trigger of his M416. When Nico returned to the corridor was suddenly filled with doors opening and men coming out. Pressing the ghost radio button, he said, "Bravo 2, we've been spotted. Hot contact. Hot contact." At this point, he kicked the man in the chest who appeared in front of him. When the man got 2 steps away, he opened holes in both his chest and both his head. The situation that seemed chaotic was actually completely under the control of the attacking side. Approximately 20 men who emerged from the servants' quarters behind the mansion were spotted by the AC-130 operator. The chief petty officer opened the control panel and activated the 20mm Vulcan. The group of approximately 20 men were torn to death by the bullets raining down from the sky. Bullseye and Tank were in the tall grass a short distance behind the trees. Tank, through his spotting scope, saw men trying to come around the side of the house. 3 men coming from behind, he warned his marksman. Bullseye said in a dull voice, "Okay." The first one to be shot was the African running from the back wearing his commando pants and tank top with side pockets. The 7.65 bullet that hit the man's head kicked up dust from the front, splattered blood and pieces of flesh on the wall, and the man fell to the ground. Bullseye had started with the last of the running men. Because if he had shot the first man, the other 2 would have definitely taken cover and made things longer. The second man was shot in the throat. Bullseye grumbled a little at having to shoot the last man in the head again and then go back and shoot the one who had been shot in the throat again. In the meantime, Tank had warned him about the 2 men on the balcony. While Bullseye was shooting one of the men on the balcony, he was killed by the other Delta Team sniper. Backup had arrived. As the Delta Team entered from the other side of the house, 2 AH-64 Apaches were taking out the remaining guards and patrols around the mansion from the trees of the forest. The heavily armed units had orders not to fire on the mansion, as they did not know the extent of the biological threat inside and there were SEALs and Delta Teams inside. A Vatican priest, Almeric was 6 feet tall and 90 kilos. The broad-shouldered man could do magic, but he had always been better with a weapon. The blue-eyed priest knocked the gun from the man's attacker's hand, knocking it out. The man took advantage of the gap and punched him. In the momentary stupor, the man's hands wrapped around Almeric's neck. Almeric placed his palms on the man's chest and said, "Vija." As a great force threw his enemy forward, Almeric drew his Glock 19 as quickly as a gunslinger, blasting multiple holes into the man's chest. His opponent hit the wall 8 meters behind him and fell to the ground, leaving a thick line of blood behind him. The doctor who passed by patted the man on the shoulder and said, "Good work," while Almeric muttered a short prayer for the dead man. He was a priest, after all. A mixture of stinging smoke hung in the air in the hall of the mansion. The crew had turned on the flashlights they were using. No one touched the electrical system because it could be a booby trap. The cold white lights of the flashlights, dazzling, were circling the rooms and corridors like rods. There was a final battle in the hall, and the enemy resistance ended here with the brutal fighting. Sanchez turned the dead man on his back with the tip of his foot. He took a picture of the man's face with his mobile phone and sent it to military intelligence. A few meters away, the ghost was talking to Mother Superior Roberta. He turned to them and said, "This is not it either." Meanwhile, Tank came to the trio, handed the satellite phone in his hand to the ghost and said, "Knox, from the CIA." "Yes." The ghost said, frowning. Knox was the agent running the operation, but Agent Ferguson had always handled the military communications. "I'm Knox," said the familiar voice. "We still haven't been able to restore the comms." "What's your status?" he asked. The ghost looked at Roberta with annoyance and said, "Polanov, no." They had learned from the sorcerers that the CIA headquarters had been raided. The CIA had consulted the sorcerers about this attack. They knew that the operators in the CIA operations room had been killed and the computers destroyed. Something must have happened to Ferguson in the meantime. Otherwise, he would have been on the other end of the phone. "The lab?" Knox's angry voice asked. "That's not there either. We just found 4 boxes of the small glass vials used for vaccines. We'll send them to the analysis lab." The Deltas took their leader down on the upper floor. The guy managed to destroy his laptop, but they took his cell phone. "They're running his data now," the ghost said, giving a general summary. "Casualties?" Knox said. This struck the ghost as odd. CIA agents were usually concerned with results. To them, casualties were just numbers. "Sister Lillian, Father Freddy, Sergeant Gunsman of the NCB, Corporal Harold, Corporal Franklin," said the ghost. Knox sighed. "Those losses are irreplaceable, Theodore. Anything I could tell you about that would be a lie. But unlike most, they gave their lives for a good cause. I'll find another source now, Lieutenant, and we'll talk again," he said, and hung up. The wood-lined corridor was lit by vintage light bulbs attached to old brass candlesticks. There were 2 guards on either side of the door where Knox stood. Large men in dark blue suits waited expressionlessly. At each end of the corridor were guards who had accompanied Gale. Knox hung up his phone and returned to the meeting. He entered a library that, like the corridor, was dark brown. The meeting place had been chosen at the last minute after he had arrived in New York. On the left side of the long hall were wooden shelves and books lined the wall. There were 4 single, high-backed, leather, very old-fashioned chairs facing each other in front of the narrow, tall windows. In one of these chairs sat Henry Paul Jackson. He was the vice chairman of Nisco Oil and its group of companies. The 65-year-old, 72-foot tall, still athletic African had almost withdrawn after the videos and photographs he had just been presented with. The other seat was occupied by Andreas Schumalerine. Schumalerine also appeared to be in his 60s. A white-haired, goggle-bearded, bespectacled man of 6 feet, he was the most powerful and well-known judge in the state of New York. He tapped the seat in sync with his chubby fingers. He didn't seem to believe what he was seeing. Gail Peterson sat in the 3rd seat. Gail sighed and looked at the documents in front of her. The man was 5 feet 5. He adjusted his horn-rimmed glasses and scratched his goggle beard briefly, straightening his posture. There were traces of fatigue around his green eyes under his thick eyebrows. Knox limped over the varnished wood repeatedly and sat down in the old but well-maintained leather chair that had been reserved for him, making a creak that interrupted the silence and stopped the conversation. Bakesfield smiled at the analyst who raised his hand and apologized for interrupting the conversation, then looked back at Gale and said, "Look, your claims are incredible. If you didn't have the documents, I would have laughed and left." Knox felt angry for a moment, but then he thought he understood the man with the aristocratic demeanor, sitting comfortably with his legs crossed. Their situation was truly hopeless. Bakesfield spread his hands. "I've reviewed the videos, the photos, the documentation. You'll have to forgive me for still not believing the magic part. Maybe biological attack is more plausible, even for an old man like me who isn't very open-minded. Anyway, let's face it, MC Rollins runs Nisco Oil, Niexgan Armory, Blue Medical Gorp, Airnex, Enernex, Lifeguarding Gorp, Banex, Telnex, and Worknex. Banex has been helping the CIA, ATF and DAE with their financial affairs for years, and last year it loaned the government $1 trillion. It owns the New York and NASDAQ stock exchanges. It even has its own cryptocurrency brand. Telnex is the only company that has won official communication contracts for the last 3 years. Enernex owns 60% of the country's energy distribution. If you arrest that guy for financing terrorism, the economy will collapse. You will be struggling with a bigger problem than the recent economic riots. If we can't stop him, he'll kill half the world at best, Knox said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. How are you going to stop it? By saying this guy is a wizard? I've watched the videos. I can't believe it. How are you going to do this? Bakesfield asked, annoyed. We don't know. If we manage to stop it, will you support us and take over the board until the crisis is resolved? Henry Paul Jackson asked, looking at Bakesfield. Henry Paul Jackson was also Gail Peterson's contact at NISCO. Bakesfield leaned back uncomfortably, elbows on the chair, fingers interlocked, and thought silently for a moment. Look, I'm the guy who founded those companies, and I turned my management over to him at the request of the board of directors. Yes, but the situation is much different than it was then. Bakesfield looked around in annoyance and sighed. Very well, but first you should talk to the board. I don't think they'll approach you the way I did, but... We've already talked to them, Henry Paul Jackson said in his bass baritone voice. Bakesfield raised one eyebrow and looked at Henry Paul Jackson in surprise. Of course, he wasn't surprised. Security Chief Allen had called him about 10 hours ago and played the audio recordings of the extraordinary and secret general meeting. Then he said, if no one objects, I'll take responsibility. After all, it's my company. If McCrollins did all this right in front of us, it's also my responsibility, he said, resigned to his fate. Our only problem in this situation is finding McCrollins and his man Polanov, Knox said, unconsciously letting out the breath he was holding. I know someone who can help you find MacDonald, Bakesfield said. Is that so? Gail asked curiously. Fanny Turner is the technical director of Telnex. It's her responsibility to make sure that McCrollins' phone wasn't tapped or monitored. If what you're saying is true, the two of them must have talked on the phone at some point, he said. August 7th, Turkish border, Syria. Jason White and Red were going to smuggle them out of Syria. They had made a deal with smugglers to get them into Turkey. Perry, who had been waiting out the night in the border town, had found a payphone and called the New York Times. His situation was worse than disaster. He had uploaded most of his voice recordings and photos to the internet. But he had no evidence about the helicopter incident in Syria. His camera and voice recorder had been lost in the attack. It was impossible to report under these conditions. Even if he did learn the truth, he would not be able to prove it. Still, he decided to take a chance. Maybe he could learn something about Gail Peterson. Knox rubbed his aching neck as the phone rang. He had fallen asleep with his arms on the table. He reached for his phone, but realized it wasn't his phone. The phone was coming from under the table. Knox looked down curiously and found FBI agent Peter Andrews' phone on charge. They must have thought the phone belonged to Knox when they moved the operations room to its new location. There was an international number on the phone screen. Peter Andrews' phone, said Agent Knox, who answered the phone. He covered his ear with his other hand to avoid being affected by the buzzing inside. The raid at the CIA had struck the Pentagon and the Capitol like lightning. All critical institutions were on red alert. The new operations room was a hall set up on one of the shelter floors on the lower floor of a main building. They now had about 60 personnel, 2 coordinators, 3 communicators, and 2 military advisors. Information was pouring in from ATF, FBI, DE, Homeland Security, and many other agencies without abbreviations. I'm Duke Perry, is Andrew available? A male voice she'd heard before asked, crackling and staticky over the intercontinental connection. Knox's eyes widened. Perry, I'm Richard Knox. We're working with the FBI, he said. So you were the one asking the questions, Duke said in a scratchy voice. Yes, it was me. Mr. Perry, your newspaper reported you missing to the State Department. Are you and your friend Joanna Swanson all right? Knox asked. Yes, we're alive, Duke said, then asked, why didn't Andrew answer the phone? He has a health problem and is on leave, Knox said, not wanting to give the reporter unnecessary information. I see, said Duke on the other end. "Where are you now? Do you want us to pick you up?" "Oh, never mind, I'll keep chasing the good news," Duke said, dismissing the question. He was sure the CIA would locate his payphone anyway, but the man on the other end sounded thoughtful, and Duke didn't like that. "Any developments on your front?" he suddenly decided to ask. "I can't give you any information on that," Knox said with a reserved expression, as he saw a familiar face enter the office door. It was Ferguson. The big African with his right arm in a bandage stared at Knox for a moment, then when he saw him, he started to walk warily toward him. "But you have the phone? The rules of the game are clear. You will show the cards in your hand while I show the cards in your hand. I will not cite a source. You will not record me," Duke said, continuing to push his luck. Knox looked around and sighed. "I don't think we need information while Mr. Perry is in this state." Duke said cheerfully, "You can read it in the paper if you like." And hung up, but the smile on his face quickly faded. He knew something was terribly wrong. He pulled out his wallet. In one of the inside pockets of his wallet was a long piece of paper. He had covered it with clear tape from the office. It had emergency phone numbers written on it. He found Andrew's home phone, tried to figure out what time it was there by looking at his watch. The number he had called rang for a long time before it was answered. The voice on the other end was a young man. Duke said, "Hello, I'm Duke Perry. I'm calling Andrew Peter from the New York Times." The young man on the other end said, "How many times do I have to say this? We have no information about my father's murder. Please leave us alone," and hung up the phone. Duke remained silent for a moment, staring at the telephone receiver in his hand. Peter was dead. Replacing the receiver, the reporter muttered, "The ice is thinning," before turning and disappearing into the crowd of the market. Knox looked at Ferguson with compassion as he sat wearily in the chair across from his desk and asked, "How are you?" Ferguson's left arm was wrapped and in a sling. As he responded, he shrugged his shoulders reflexively, his face contorted a little, and said, "You know, I look like I've been kicked by a horse," with a grunt. "I don't know, to tell you the truth. I've never been kicked by a horse," Knox said calmly, shaking his head. "Never mind, you haven't lost anything. It's the kind of thing you don't want to try." "Did any of the kids survive?" Ferguson asked, smiling. When Knox merely shook his head, he pursed his lips and asked, "Peter?" "For FBI agent Peter Andrew." Knox nodded again and said, "He was dead too. How did these bastards get into the CIA?" Ferguson asked, clenching his right fist. His fist made a creaking sound and bones cracking. "Homeland is investigating this," Knox grumbled. "More importantly, how did they find us?" Ferguson asked, frowning. "Let's not get into the building. Are you curious about how they found us?" Knox said sarcastically. Ferguson leaned forward and whispered, "Isn't it ridiculous? They're almost constantly one step ahead of us. Have you ever wondered how they do it?" "Believe me, that's the last question I want to ask myself," Knox said with a sigh. "Maybe it's too late to ask," Ferguson said, leaning back in his chair, looking bored. Knox had known Ferguson for years. If Ferguson was talking like this, he must be trying to steer the conversation somewhere. "What's on your mind?" Knox asked. It wasn't normal for Ferguson to be here anyway. His doctor at the hospital had said he would be in bed for at least a month. If Ferguson had come here, he must have only managed to do so by escaping from the hospital. Ferguson nodded behind Knox. Knox turned to see Colonel Stevens waiting calmly a few meters behind him. Jordan Stevens was 6 feet tall and about 300 pounds. Broad-shouldered, athletic, blond, and blue-eyed, he was here to coordinate the Pentagon and the CIA. Ferguson lowered his voice a little. "We've known Jordan Stevens for a long time. We've had something that concerns us." Stevens nodded to Knox and approached them. "We have this information from a reliable source in Syria," he said, placing several files and photographs on the table. Knox examined the files and photographs, cursing in a marine-like manner, and stopped at the last photograph. It was taken from a considerable distance, showing Tanner, Polanov, and Gail Peterson in the same frame. Martin Grayson was the only MIT graduate among the CIA computer operators. His real expertise was communications protocols, and after graduating, he had been unable to find a job, and had joined the CIA with dreams of an exciting life he had seen in movies. The thin man had brown, messy hair. His hair, which hung over his shoulders, had been tied back with a rubber band about 12 hours ago, and most of it had declared his freedom. His eyes were red, his eye sockets sunken and bruised from exhaustion. After 72 hours of not sleeping and entering people's bank accounts and private computers, he went to the operations room kitchen, hating his job. As he poured himself coffee, the bass baritone voice behind him said, "What did you say your name was, son?" Martin turned, barely able to stop himself from jumping. He came face to face with Ferguson's broad chest. Although he perceived Martin's intrusion into his 3 feet of personal space as a threat, what really scared him was how a giant like Ferguson could approach him so silently. Martin had just opened his mouth to speak when he heard his own name from the second exit to the kitchen on his right. Martin Grayson, MIT Electronic Communications Specialist 2024, has been with us for a year, born in Nebraska, the second child of Erica and Henson Grayson. "Only 2 traffic tickets," said the man in the colonel's uniform who entered the kitchen with a file in his hand. According to the CIA observer, he might have a slight fondness for marijuana. "A little marijuana never hurt anybody," a third voice said from the kitchen entrance to Martin's left. When Martin looked up, beads of sweat forming on his forehead, he was met with Knox, the director of the operation. "Son, can you work well under pressure?" Ferguson asked, taking the coffee cup from the young man's shaking hand. Martin swallowed and nodded. But he did so hastily that his head appeared to be shaking rather than nodding. Colonel Stevens walked over to the coffee machine, slammed the file down on the table with a loud bang, and asked, "So, would you like something a little more exciting?" "It could be," Martin said, looking at the man curiously. Now that she realized Ferguson wasn't going to rape her, she had calmed down a bit. "But it could be dangerous," Knox said, moving slower than the others. The young man swallowed hard and asked, "What exactly do you want from me?" Ferguson smiled and took the coffee the colonel had handed him, walked over to the table where Knox was sitting, gave him coffee and sat down next to him. "We have a mole. We lost a lot of men because of it, some of them were your boys, and Polanov's bastards were always one step ahead of us," he said. Colonel Stevens handed Martin his coffee and said, "We want to trip him up and get a few steps ahead." Knox took a sip of his coffee. "I hope you don't mind cheating in games." "How can I help you?" Martin asked with a smile. Ferguson narrowed his eyes and asked, "Can you forward all of a phone's calls to us and answer the calls from the numbers it calls?" "Is that all?" Martin asked, grinning. Ferguson grinned in response and said, "Son, if you can do that for 12 hours, we can save the world." August 8, Malibu, California, USA. Fanny Turner was found dead in her house. The city police who found her said that the victim had been killed no more than an hour ago. All they had left were Delta Force computer experts. Their investigation had led all suspicions to the same disposable phone. They had traced the phone's signal to a 3-story building in Malibu, California, a few miles west of Lower Topanga Lagoon on the Pacific Coast Highway, which had been an art gallery for 10 years. The gallery had closed and the owner had died of a heart attack a few years earlier. But for the past month, the house had been running on electricity and water, and its bills had been paid regularly in cash. There was no other building nearby, but the house was squeezed between the beach and the highway, making it a good place to hide. Delta Force's reconnaissance had confirmed that Polanov was in the building. All that remained was to capture or stop him. 2 Skorsky Blackhawks stopped on the water 5 meters from the ocean with Zodiac boats underneath them. The teams whose boats were left in the ocean jumped from the Blackhawks into the water immediately afterwards. As the scattered clouds flowed eastward over the ocean, a gentle breeze roamed over the calm waves. Many stars in the sky twinkled from the dark sky among the clouds. Sanchez, counting the group climbing into the Zodiac boat from the cool ocean, signaled to the ghost that everyone was on the boat. The silencer boats shot forward, leaving white foam behind. They were 2 nautical miles away from their target. The teams, wearing black operation suits and Kevlar assault vests, were using their operation muscles. Night vision equipment was attached to the foreheads of the muscles. Night vision binoculars were a tool that gathered very little light together and colored objects or people to see. This equipment, which was first used in World War II, was developed over time and its performance was increased. The sorcerers did not use night vision equipment. Shortly after each of them boarded the helicopter, they mumbled something, their eyes glowing a pastel orange. The 2 teams that had landed were armed with silenced M4S and M416S. The third man in the lead group, Communications Officer Martin Dunn, tapped his radio and said, "Black 1 and Black 2 on the beach." He checked to see if the team behind him had taken their places. They hadn't had much time to work together. The first team, SEAL 5, had formed a V formation for safety. Nico, who was at the back of the second group gathered behind them, was smiling with his black camouflage on his face and was saying, just like in the computer games, when Roberta stopped him with a glare. Roberta calmly turned to her right and made a sign to the young woman behind her. The young woman repeated Roberta's hand sign and showed the same sign to the man behind her. They both whispered the same thing at the same time and quickly began to become transparent. Anton Solis, nicknamed Bear, who was standing in line with them, shook his head from side to side. Working with magicians was truly incredible. The 2 magicians had become transparent as glass, only the light areas behind them formed faint distortions of images. If they didn't know where to look, it would have been impossible to see them. The 2 formed 2 sets of footprints parallel to each other on the beach and headed towards the old 3-story building. The 2 who controlled the entrance to the building pressed the radio latch 3 times. There were protection and warning spells on the door. They were expecting this, so after placing plastic explosives on the door leading to the beach, they moved to the corners and took up protective positions. Their spells would last about 3 minutes and would not be broken until they were attacked. When they pressed the latch of their radios twice to tell them that they had done their job, the 2 teams on the beach quickly moved towards the house. Theodore, known as the Ghost, settled in at the door and said, "We're at point 2. This was the signal for the assault team consisting of 2 Humvees waiting on the highway and the sniper team waiting on the rocky terrain above the highway. Eric Borna, positioned on the hill northwest of the house, turned the safety on his 12.7mm Barrett M110 rifle. The rifle, with a large scope and a full metal body, had been developed by the American Barrett Firearms Company. It was used by many NATO-affiliated armies, in addition to American Special Forces. It used .50 caliber, or 12.7mm, ammunition. The magazine capacity was usually 10, but there were also versions that held 5 bullets. The long and large rifle had a barrel like a small field gun. Eric hated this weapon because it kicked almost like a mule. Although this kick was absorbed by the spring system inside the weapon, it wasted unnecessary time when it was necessary to fire consecutive shots. Still, Eric knew that if he fired this 15-pound little gun, someone would not get away with it. Because the M110's bullet was powerful enough to tear off the limbs of the enemy it hit and completely shatter their heads. It could penetrate lightly armored vehicles. Eric tapped his radio and said, "Bullseye ready." "Mobile group ready," said Delta Force Commander Stephen Lockwind, commanding the Humvees just behind them. The Ghost exchanged glances with Sanchez. He nodded to the sergeant and then ducked behind the man in front of him. The explosives expert Sanchez had the detonator's hand controls. "Detonator," Sanchez warned, tapping the doctor on the shoulder. While the Ghost and his team were advancing towards the stairs leading to the upper floors, Sanchez and his team had started to clean the beach floor. The Ghost, who shot a man who appeared at the top of the stairs, saw the man fall back and continued to advance quickly. They were in a standard advance position. The group, with their heads bent towards the rifle sights, guns leaning on their shoulders, knees bent and leaning forward, looked like a flawless example of a lesson scene. When the Ghost and Bear, who were climbing the stairs, came to the first room, the Bear threw a stun grenade into the room and leaned against the wall. The Ghost entered the room through the gap. At this time, the Bear shouted, "Contact!" from behind him and fired. The ghost found two men who had been blinded by the stun grenade and were trying to see him. Both of them were wearing tank tops, plaid shirts and denim pants like Spanish gang members. While the men with bandanas were desperately scanning the surroundings with their AK-47s, the ghost shot them in the head and left the room. The bear was waiting for him outside. His hand was on the right side of his stomach. Blood was seeping through his fingers. When he made eye contact with the ghost, he shook his head. The ghost said over his radio, "Bear is wounded, bear is wounded," and turned back to the corridor. Two bodies were lying on the ground in the dark corridor. He hadn't even gone a meter when he saw two people in front of him. The first man was holding an AK-47. Before the ghost man could fire, he shot him in the right eye, above his right eye, and in the right cheekbone. As the man fell to the ground, the young man diagonally behind him had completed his spell. The lightning bolts coming out of his fingers shattered the frame light bulbs and wooden wall coverings in the hallway and moved forward and hit the ghost. Suddenly caught in the electric current, the ghost fell to the ground groaning, while the bear coming from behind started to advance by pressing the trigger of the M249 saw in his hand. However, the man who threw the lightning had covered himself with a dark blue sphere. The bear, whose bullets ricocheted, was prepared for this. Bullseye, open the way. He shouted. Bullseye, who was watching the group with the thermal camera on his rifle, pulled the trigger of the M110. The M110 steel-headed, Teflon-coated bullet, the thickness of an adult man's middle finger, tore through the air from where Bullseye was positioned on top, exploding the hand-thick concrete wall of the house, the magic shield, and the wizard's head. Then it continued on its way, smashing through the other wall. As the bear approached the door of the second room on his right, the wall suddenly exploded towards him in pieces, throwing the big man against the left wall. The black-clad man in the room had fired with his Benelli M1014 pump-action shotgun. When the 12-gauge shotgun passed through the thin wall and hit the bear behind it against the other wall, his eyes glowed with a red light because of the spell he had cast to see in the dark. His vision allowed him to partially see the bear behind the wall. The man fired again at the big soldier who was on his knees, and noticed that the soldier was suddenly surrounded by a force shield. Nico, who came from behind the ghost and the bear, came to the rescue. The bear suddenly saw that he was surrounded by a blue energy field. The wall broke apart again and 5 12-gauge shotgun balls coming towards him hit this force field and glowed. Although the bear did not feel pain from the shock of being shot, he knew that his condition was not good. His rifle must have remained where it was shot. Waves of pain were throbbing from his right ribs, his shoulder and wrist were burning continuously. In an instant, the surroundings were covered in darkness like the blue sphere, and someone grabbed him hard by the nape of his Kevlar vest and pulled him back. Although the bear could not see anything, he heard the voice of a woman from the sorcerers. "Calm down, I'm pulling you back," he said. As he was going back, Bear, who had emerged from the darkness, noticed that the corridor was covered by a black mat wall. Next to them, Nico was preparing a spell with both hands raised. While his right hand was moving slowly, his left hand remained still, his fingers tense. The wizard next to him, aiming into the darkness, touched the young man's shoulder. With the distortion of his left hand, both the darkness and the magic around Bear were lifted. 3 people appeared at the other end of the corridor and at the door of the room where Bear had been shot. The wizard who touched Nico's shoulder cursed through his teeth and shot the man in the back corner of the corridor, while purple glowing arrows came out of Nico's hand and hit the man with the shotgun in his hand. The man, who fell silently to the ground, fired one last shot at the ceiling where he fell. Before the last man could fire, he was shattered by another hole opened in the wall and collapsed to the ground. Bullseye continued to provide cover fire from outside. Sanchez threw the stun grenade into the dark room on his left and waited for it to explode. When he heard the explosion, he went inside. There was a simple bed and chair in the small room. The man, who was affected by the stun grenade, aimed the AK-47 in his hand at Sanchez without seeing him, but he could not fire because he pulled the trigger without cocking his gun. Sanchez was not someone who pushed his luck. He shot the man in the head and chest, killing him. When Sanchez stepped into the hallway, Mother Superior Roberta threw one of the silver throwing knives on her left leg at the man who appeared at the beginning of the short hallway. Sanchez realized that the woman was doing this move with more speed and skill than a swordswoman. As soon as the silver knife left the woman's hand, a word escaped the sister's lips amidst the sounds of clashing. Sanchez didn't know what the woman said, but the weapon that was circling in the air instantly copied itself and transformed into 6 throwing knives, embedding itself into her enemy's chest at regular intervals. Another nun had entered the room diagonally across from them. But this time her enemy was prepared. As the young woman who entered the room screamed with the flames surrounding her and left the room, holes formed at regular intervals in the wall between the room and the corridor. The man inside had raked the wall with his AK-47. In the dust, smoke and chaos, Sanchez saw the doctor collapse to the ground holding his neck. Blood was coming from between his fingers and mouth. A nun who leaned over tried to pull him back and was shot in the chest and collapsed to the ground. Sanchez, who left the room, shot the man who had only stuck out the barrel of his gun and his head as far as his left eye could see at the end of the corridor, but before he could control the corridor, fire was opened again from the room across from him. As Sanchez threw himself backwards, 2 bolts of lightning crossed the corridor, illuminating the whole area and briefly blinding the senior sergeant. The 2 priests who came to the corridor had gained the upper hand with their lightning. The man in the room to their right had reloaded his weapon, but when he heard the sound of 2 metals falling inside, the first thing he did was to create the blue shield spell. When the shock grenade and the grenade that exploded immediately caused sparkles around the shield, the smiling man's mocking expression faded away when he saw the High Priestess Roberta entering inside. The blue shield spell was a spell designed for very fast missile weapons. It had certain limits. Its durability was directly proportional to the level of the sorcerer. The spell, which could resist simple pistol and rifle bullets, did not work against the 12.7mm rifle bullets that Bullseye used outside. Roberta did a somersault in the room she entered, said, "Asheratl." And the flaming arrows coming out of her hand entered the man inside the blue protective sphere. The flaming arrows coming out of her fingers drew irregular and difficult to follow routes and entered the man's chest. The man opened his mouth and eyes with a silent scream. Yellow and red lights came out of both of them and the man fell silently to his knees. Smoke was coming out of his eyes which had turned to ashes. The first 3 Delta forces to enter through the exploding door on the upper floor saw an orange ball coming towards them from the other end of the large hall. They knew from their training with the wizards that it was the fireball spell. Out! 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 The team leader shouted. But it was too late. "Son of a bitch," Bullseye said from atop the rocks as the doors and windows on the ground floor exploded outward in bright red flame. Everything in his thermal scope was jumbled with the heat of the fireball spell. Martin Dunn, aka Tank, and the priest Liam had entered the corridor on the side, and had made it about 5 meters without a hitch until they came across 2 men coming out of the end of the corridor. One of the men fired a volley while the other threw something towards them. Although Tank couldn't see what it was clearly, he knew it was a grenade. "Grenade!" he said as Liam reached out his left hand and cast a protective spell over the defensive grenade rolling towards them on the ground. The grenade exploded with a muffled sound inside the blue sphere, and the stool glowed white for a moment. The spell worked, but the enemy took advantage of the moment and fired, hitting Liam in the head. While Liam silently collapsed into the dark eternity, Tank cursed through his teeth, shooting first the man on the right, then the man on the left. There was nothing that could be done for the priest. Tank, who continued to fight while honoring the priest's sacrifice, reached the end of the corridor and turned right again. There were sounds of struggle coming from the first room here. The man who had no more shock bombs rushed in. When he entered the large and messy room, he saw that it was the size of a living room. There was a broken table on the floor and a nun lying in the middle. 2 bodies were lying in front of and behind the nun. A fluorescent cable was hanging from the top of the dark room. The lamp that was lit from time to time only made it difficult to see. Next to the table were 2 boxes with small vaccine ampules in them. Tank saw 3 people struggling right in front of him. A priest was being held by 2 people. The man's right hand, leaning against the wall, was in the air at head level. The man on his right side was holding his wrist and throat. The one on the left was holding the priest's left wrist with his left hand. A bright green light circled around the man's right hand as he shouted a magic command, illuminating all three men. The light suddenly extended and sharpened, turning into a triangular dagger 1.5 handspan long. While the man was stabbing the priest's left ribs with all his might, Tank was aiming his M4 at the two, but was thrown to the left side of the room by a sudden blow from his left. He hit a glass cabinet with a loud bang and fell to the ground, scattering glass like shrapnel. An enemy had caught him in the area he couldn't see in the right corner and had thrown him here. The man who was running towards him was holding an M10 Ingram. The .45 caliber weapon, which required great physical strength to use with one hand, hit and shattered the walls and furniture around Tank, while many bullets hit Tank in the shoulder, chest and rifle. The man running towards him was out of magazine. While Tank was cursing when he saw the bend in the firing mechanism of his rifle, his enemy threw his weapon aside in anger, drew a machete that he had slung diagonally across his back and pulled it out. In response, Tank threw a fallen stool in front of him with his foot towards the man's face. At the same time, two men who had killed the priest were running towards him on the left diagonally. Tank, who had broken the stool that came to his face with his machete, grabbed the man by the wrist and applied the basic Aikijutsu move Iraminage and slid to the man's right diagonally. Pulling the armed wrist hard, he drew a circular motion and swung his opponent towards his two friends who were attacking him, while also taking his machete from his hand. When the man rolled and hit his first friend with a growl, the machete that Tank threw quickly buried itself in the chest of the first man running towards him. In the meantime, the man with the green energy dagger in his hand jumped by stepping on the broken table and reached Tank. Tank avoided the man's dagger and threw him back. In the meantime, the man he swung came back with anger. The man who drew his knife next to his boots made a stabbing movement from above with his knife. Tank slid to the outside diagonal of the man again, avoided the weapon's route, supported the hand holding the weapon from above, pushed and guided it, and helped the knife to be buried in the owner's leg. While the man was screaming with pain and disappointment, Tank caught him from behind his head and jaw and broke his neck. However, he had lost a lot of time with this move. The man with the green dagger caught him running and pushed him towards the wall. One hand was on Tank's throat, the other was raised to head level to stab the energy dagger in. Tank only caught that hand and slammed it into the wall with a loud bang. The ghost opened his eyes and tried to pull himself together. His hands and feet were still tingling. The big man who was trying to pull himself together realized that he was being pulled to the top of the stairs. There was a dead priest next to him. The man who pulled himself together saw his night vision equipment. He noticed that his radio was silent as he removed the equipment from his helmet and threw it away. The ghost, who had set up his weapon, turned back to the corridor. The fight was still going on further down the corridor. The wall shattered and collapsed towards the corridor. Two people tumbled into the corridor amidst the white dust. Both of them were quite large. One of them had a bright green light covering his right hand. The light was sharpening like an extension of his hand. His left hand was around the man on the ground's throat. However, the man on the ground had also grabbed the arm made of green light by the wrist. The ghost could not see well enough to fire. Therefore, he started to move quickly through the corridor that was in the chaos of battle. In the meantime, the man below him quickly pushed himself forward and slid on the ground. The man below, who gained momentum with this movement, moved clockwise and pulled his energy dagger towards the ground. As the green energy beam sank into the ground, the man pushed the man's left hand even further away with his right hand and hit the man on top of him in the kidneys with all his might. The ghost heard the man on top screaming with pain and passion. At this moment, the man grabbed the man who was leaning forward by the collar of his bulletproof vest, pulled him down and punched him in the ear with his left hand again. The man on the ground grabbed the man who was silent with this punch by the collar from the right side and pulled him down quickly and got on top of him. Although he saved his right hand from the ground as he fell to the ground, the man was doomed. Because the ghost knew this move. This was Tank. The Marine Corps sergeant, known as Tank, lifted the fallen man's right wrist up and struck him hard on the right elbow with the heel of his left hand. The broken arm snapped with a wet crunch, and suddenly snapped into an inverted V shape. As his opponent screamed, Dunn raised his left fist momentarily and brought his guarded elbow down on the man lying parallel to him, silencing his scream. Rolling to his feet, Dunn rolled to his left and drew his last remaining weapon, a knife behind his waist, against the ghost, whom he thought was a new enemy. But when he saw that it was the ghost, he smiled. At that moment, an energy beam coming from behind caught Tank and threw him out of the broken glass window in front of him. The energy had come from the room door Tank had turned his back to. When he saw the man coming out of this room, the ghost pulled the trigger without hesitation and opened 6 holes in his enemy's chest. The 6 bullets that pierced his body threw pieces from the corridor wall behind him, while the man collapsed back into the room he came from with blood spraying from his mouth. Even in this short time, the ghost could see that the man he had shot had cut his hair like a punk. The ghost, who quickly came to the room, saw that the man lying on the ground was Polanov. The Serbian terrorist, who was lying weakly on the ground, was trying to reach the grenade at his waist. The ghost approached the man and broke his fingers by stepping on his hand. Polanov did not seem to feel the pain of this. He looked at the ghost and said with his mouth full of blood, "Brotherhood, rise up." "But he won't go up with you," the ghost said, stepping on Polanov's hand as he tried to reach for his gun. No matter how much he wanted to kill him, the information they were going to get was very important. Gail Peterson was sitting in her room, turning her phone on and off again, because it wouldn't work. She called the phone company. According to the phone company, there was no fault on the lines. Her phone must have been broken. So she called the service department of the phone brand. The service would send her a new phone. When Gail got tired of messing with her phone, which couldn't work, she turned on her TV. Peterson, who saw the footage of the raid on Malibu on CNN's General News, unconsciously stood up from her desk. As her glass of whiskey fell to the floor, the door to her room opened and 4 CIA Homeland Security personnel entered. 3 hours later, a well-lit garden was 20 meters around the white-painted building that resembled a rectangular prism. Many trees that could grow in the area were planted for the garden. At the entrance of the building, Barack Obama Hospital was written on a large rock. At 3:20 in the morning, 2 FBI agents were checking the entrances and exits at the intensive care unit entrance on the 6th floor of the fully equipped hospital. It had been 10 years since the modern hospital was built. Attention had been paid to its design as much as its equipment. Light gray columns and doors divided the white walls. Colorful pictures that would not make people feel sad or depressed were hung on the walls. However, someone who was careful could notice that these pictures were also examples of minimalist movements. The shiny marley floor reflected the light as if it were marble. The ceiling lights came from square-shaped white, opaque plastic pieces of different heights in a homogeneous way. Agent Barlow, who turned in that direction with the sound of the elevator on the other side of the corridor, looked at the nurse coming towards him. The blonde woman with an athletic walk and skin as white as marble talked and joked with the floor attendant passing by for a short while. Barlow smiled back at the woman who looked at him and smiled as he approached. The young FBI agent was 5 feet 5, short brown hair, brown eyes, and rather cute than handsome. He was broad-shouldered, with a broad, angular face and dimples that appeared when he smiled. He was wearing a dark gray suit. "Good morning," the woman said in a melodic voice. "Your manager called our manager to check on the patient more often." "Yes, he may have," Barlow said, smiling, and quickly added, "but I can't let you in without checking," when the young woman smiled and nodded in understanding. "I'm Agent Barlow," Barlow said into his walkie-talkie. His partner next to him looked at him. He was a hand taller than Barlow. The black-haired man had eyes as dark as his hair. He was wearing a navy suit and holding a rolled-up copy of the New York Times in his hand. Barlow had begun acting like a 1940s actor to impress the nurse. "Check ID, ICU nurse Kate Perkins," he said. "That's right, Kate Perkins is under intensive care," said the voice on the radio. "What time does your shift end?" Barlow asked, smiling as he moved out of the nurse's way. The nurse used her magnetic card to open the sliding intensive care door and asked, hesitantly, "Why?" "I think I have a fever and I don't feel well," Barlow's partner said, turning his head to the side to keep from laughing. The young woman also had a mischievous smile on her face and said to the agent, "I'll be taking over at 8 in the morning, Agent Barlow. If you can hold out until then, I can give you some medication. The woman said in a tone close to a cat's purr. You really are sick, Ballow's partner said with a laugh as the ICU door closed behind the young nurse. Barlow grinned, spreading his hands wide, but it worked, as the elevator opened again and a 5'7" brunette and slightly plump nurse emerged. The woman slowly approached, yawning and looking at the FBI agents. Which one of you is Barlow? Agent Barlow looked at the woman's ID card that said Kate Perkins. Cursing, the two FBI agents entered the intensive care unit and found only Polanov's lifeless body in the unit. The flock of about 50 swallows that had left the hospital had not attracted anyone's attention. The swallows first turned north, then east, and headed towards a Jeep Cherokee parked in a secluded alley 1 block from the hospital. Before reaching the ground, the birds turned into small, pitch-black plant leaves and first formed a spiral around themselves. Then this spiral materialized and turned into the blonde nurse who had just entered the intensive care unit. She was now wearing black clothes that would have destroyed an assault team in London. The woman opened the Cherokee's door with the key she took from her waist and got inside, dialing a number she had memorized earlier on the burner phone in the vehicle. When the female voice on the phone said, "Hello," she said, "The job is done," and hung up, throwing the phone into the trash can she passed on the way out. Nat Fernandez and Nadia had been on the New York subway for a few minutes. When they found a seat next to each other, Fernandez began to examine his surroundings. Nadia, whose phone was ringing with a playful melody, looked at her BlackBerry with a sigh. Seeing the international dialing code for Bolivia, the woman smiled and answered the phone, saying, "Hello?" The female voice on the other end said in a cold tone, "The job is done." Nadia hung up the phone and looked at Nat Fernandez, who was sitting next to her, and smiling, said, "My ex." Nat Fernandez grumbled, shaking his head. Nadia had combed her hair back into a ponytail. She was wearing a tight, low-cut bodysuit, generously showing off her breasts, while she was wearing fitted denim trousers and high heels, and had a beige Louis Vuitton bag on her arm. When Nat Fernandez first saw her, he looked at her with disdain. She was wearing her usual pair of side-pocketed trousers, a loose shirt, sneakers, a scarf around her neck and a baseball cap. She had taken her backpack with her as usual when she left the hotel. "I don't understand why Polanov asked me to take you with me. You can't even run in those trousers," he said. "Because I won't have to run," said Nadia with her usual amused expression. Fernandez looked at the woman with contempt and asked, "Is that so? Why?" "Because it wasn't Polanov who asked me to come with you," Nadia said, smiling warmly at the woman. Fernandez turned to Nadia with curiosity, feeling a thin ache on the back of his neck, along with the silky touch of the pale Russian. He reached for his gun at his waist, but Nadia grabbed his wrist with unexpected strength, holding him back. Fernandez resisted her, suddenly realizing that he couldn't move his arms or legs, and his eyes widened in panic. Nadia smiled, synthetic curare. "Calm down, it'll wear off soon. It does this when it enters your body near your spinal cord." Curare was one of the poisonous plants hunters used on their arrows in South America. It also had paralyzing properties. The CIA had used this poison as an effective weapon for years. Curare binds to the acetylcholine receptors in the muscles and blocks them, paralyzing the motor system and causing the creature to lose its ability to move. Nadia had used a developed version of this poison on Fernandez. Fernandez tried to mutter, while he still had the strength, "Polanov, avenge me." "Polanov is dead, baby," Nadia said, shaking her head, and she left Fernandez's lifeless body on the subway seat as if he were sleeping, and got off at the station where they arrived. Fernandez would be found by the New York police an hour or so later. End of Chapter 1. Hello, if you liked my story, don't forget to like, comment, share. This story belongs to owner Dialer's Tales of the Forbidden City concept. In this concept, there is a timeline and all the stories are connected to it.